Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to a special edition of Two Nates on Sports. My name is Nathan Kwan, and joining me is Nathan Simmons, and we are joined by Kevin Hahn as we're going to break down the 2017-2018 NBA season. Kevin, welcome back.
All right. Thanks, guys, for having me on again. It's good to be back. The NBA season is starting next Tuesday. We're all really excited for that. I guess we'll get started with the preview of the Rockets. We know that the expectations from the new owner of the team, Tillman Fertitta, is that they'll make at least the Western Conference Finals. It won't be easy by any means, given how stacked the West is this year. But I think the Rockets have a chance to really go all the way with this roster this year. A lot of people have been saying that adding Chris Paul has hurt the Rockets' depth with all the assets they gave up in the trade. But if you really look at their entire roster up and down, they kept their main shooters in Harden, Ariza, Anderson, and Eric Gordon. And the biggest loss was probably Lou Williams, but they offset that with the signings of PJ Tucker and Luke Mbah a Moute, who make the Rockets really a more defensive-minded team. And I think the PJ Tucker signing for 4 years and $32 million was really an underrated move in the offseason that might have flown under the radar. When the Raptors added PJ Tucker last season, they became one of the better defensive teams in the league. Some of the credit really goes to Serge Ibaka, but Tucker's defensive impact on the floor really can't be overlooked. Opponents are only shooting 26% from three with him guarding the perimeter. And we all know the Rockets can score with the best teams in the league, but their defense is what they're going to have to rely on if they really want to stop the fast-paced teams like the Warriors. The addition of Tucker and Mbah a Moute into the lineup really improves the Rockets' perimeter defense significantly, which I think will give them an edge on that side of the floor. And obviously adding Chris Paul is huge for the Rockets as well, not only from a leadership and elite passing ability he brings to the team, but also from a defensive standpoint. People often forget Chris Paul is one of the best defensive guards in the league. He led the league in steals 6 of the last 9 seasons, which is crazy. And he finished third in steals last year behind Draymond Green and John Wall. And like I said before, the Rockets have a lot of decent scoring threats off the bench, like Eric Gordon, who's the reigning sixth man of the year, and he can go off any given night and score 30 off the bench. And even a guy like Troy Williams, he can get hot from three. The Rockets won't have a problem with scoring, but again, the improvements they made defensively during the offseason is what I think will elevate them to the next level.
Wow, I couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah, I agree with these underrated signings of Tucker and Mbah a Moute. I think we saw in the playoffs against the Spurs, they couldn't stop them at times. In order to beat Golden State, you're going to have to get some defensive stops. You can't just try to outscore them, beat them at their own game. And yeah, as we mentioned all throughout the offseason, Paul and Harden, how that fit meshes early on and going through the season, I think is going to be key on how far this team goes. Both guys have excel with the ball in their hands throughout their career, and now they're going to have to play off of each other, and the locker room dynamic with Paul being the leader and Harden. I think this team is about where they were last year. That maybe a couple games better, but I think right now, if I'd have to pick, I'd say they're the second best team in the West behind Golden State.
Yeah, as an outsider, I'm definitely impressed by the improvements that this Houston Rockets team has done. If I have to add one more thing, I would say look for the X factor to be Eric Gordon going forward. He's the defending sixth man of the year, and it's going to be interesting to see how he fits in with those two guards already starting. But that also being said, if I had to make a prediction for this Houston Rockets team, I would say that this team either finishes third and makes it to the Western Conference Championship or a bit below that. But this is, I would say, like either your second or third best team in the West, and absolutely has a chance of making it to the NBA Finals.
Yeah, and another thing I wanted to bring up was Clint Capella could really be key. Nene was so big for the Rockets last year. You saw that in the playoffs against the Thunder. He had a great series, but this is Clint Capella's 4th year in the league. He's 23. I've watched videos of him throughout, summer league and the preseason, and he seems to have added more to his offensive game, which really he's improved so much in that area in addition to his great defense. So I think Clint Capella could be another X factor for this team, kind of under the radar, but so important at that center spot.
Absolutely. But let's now move on to a team with less exciting prospects for this season, but may actually be pretty exciting going forward. We have the Dallas Mavericks. What's interesting about them is just the young core they've been able to develop in such a short time. Obviously, you have Nerlens Noel, who was traded for at the deadline. and he was actually brought back on a one-year deal because he's betting on himself to perform really well this year and get that max contract that he believes he deserves. And I mean, he's clearly capable of. But also you have Harrison Barnes, who they signed in the summer of 2016. Both Harrison Barnes and Nerlens Noel back in high school were considered the best players coming out. And then you also add someone who arguably could have been the best player coming out of high school if he hadn't been in such a stacked class, in Dennis Smith, who they added with the 9th overall pick in this year's NBA draft. Unfortunately, though, it looks like Dennis Smith did have a little bit of a scare this past week with a rolled ankle, but it looks like he's going to be fine and he should be able to play in the season opener. But going forward, this is an interesting core with Nerlens at center, Harrison Barnes, an interesting role between both the small forward and the stretch power forward position. And then you have Dennis Smith running the point. Big stories going into it is whether or not Dennis Smith can pull off Rookie of the Year, whether or not they can all fit together. And I would say one of the bigger stories for this season, especially since it's not that likely that they make it into the playoffs. Although, I mean, you'd never count out a team that's coached by Rick Carlisle. I mean, that guy's a magician. But I would say the biggest story in terms of milestones is that this probably will be Dirk Nowitzki's last season. And so it's going to be interesting to see how he's able to perform and how this team is able to sort of mesh around a veteran leader that's probably going to be taking his victory lap. What do you guys think of this team going forward?
Yeah, I think the Dallas Mavericks have a really solid young core, and Dennis Smith Jr., Nerlens Noel, and Harrison Barnes, and even Wes Matthews. If he's healthy, he's one of the most lethal three-point shooting threats out there. Dennis Smith is actually my pick for Rookie of the Year, given how often he'll have the ball in his hands. They'll have to rely on him for a bulk of the scoring since they don't have a lot of scoring options on the team other than Harrison Barnes and an aging Dirk Nowitzki. And usually the Rookie of the Year goes to whoever leads the rookies in scoring. And I definitely expect Dennis Smith to average around 18 to 20 points a game. Obviously, the favorites to win this award are Lonzo Ball from the Lakers or Ben Simmons from the Sixers. But both of them are really pass-first players looking to set up their teammates. So I don't expect them to score a lot for their teams. And Dennis Smith Jr., it goes without saying, he's insanely athletic. And as a rookie, he's probably the second most athletic point guard in the league, right behind Westbrook. Dallas definitely might have found their franchise point guard, barring injuries, of course. So, but given how stacked the West is this year and how basically 7 teams are fighting for those last 4 playoff spots in the West, I don't think the Mavs really have a chance to make the postseason this year. They definitely have a solid young core for the future, but it might be another few years before the Mavs are in playoff contention again.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Kevin there. I think Dennis Smith Jr. is going to be very interesting to watch to see how he runs his offense. The Mavs last year were not very good offensively. They're like 22nd in offensive rating. So that point guard that they've been missing, how he orchestrates that offense with, as you mentioned, Barnes and Matthews and Nowitzki and Seth Curry. I think the bench is going to be the issue. There's not a lot of depth there. I mean, JJ Barea at this point, Yogi Ferrell showed a little bit last year, but needs to show more consistency as an NBA player. And then Nerlens Noel, as Nathan mentioned, getting that late contract, betting on himself. We'll see how effective he is. He had a good rookie year, but he has a lot more potential left in his game, I think, in this league. So as you guys mentioned, young core, I think better than last year, but still not a playoff team. They're probably around 10th or 11th in the West.
Yeah, I'd say those are fair predictions. And honestly, at the end of the day, like, this team could probably still use a lottery pick to help rebuild this team and put them back into contention sooner rather than later. But let's move on to the true contenders for the NBA championship for this upcoming season. We've already touched on the Houston Rockets. Obviously, I mean, how much can we really talk about the defending champions, the Golden State Warriors? That hasn't already been said. But I mean, do you guys have anything to say about the Golden State Warriors?
Yeah, like you said, there's really not much to say with this team other than that this is their title to lose. They're still the heavy favorites. I think in the general manager survey, 90% of them had the Warriors winning the championship this year. And the scary thing is they got even better during the offseason. They'd added Omri Caspi and Nick Young, who bring even more three-point shooting to their bench. And the Warriors are just so good from top to bottom that I don't see anyone in the league really challenging them in a 7-game series. Really, the only way is if one of their stars gets injured. But even then, they're still the favorites to win the championship. So really, they're head and shoulders above everyone else in the league.
Gonna have to agree with you there. If you had to give me Golden State or the field, I would still take the field just because, as you mentioned, they're one freak injury away. But if everybody's healthy, this is by far head and shoulders above everybody else. They bring back the best offensive team, the number 2 best defensive team. And as you mentioned, they added Swaggy P to the bench. So there's a little bit more depth there. And I mean, everybody is still so young, and they re-signed Andre Iguodala, which was key. I think there was a time during the offseason that they were thinking about Iguodala maybe going to the Rockets or another team, and that would really hurt them defensively and off the bench because he was a 6th man of the year contender. I think he was a runner-up. So bringing him back and bringing back that outstanding firepower in Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Kevin Durant, Draymond Green, those four All-Stars, I will pick them to be the number 1 team in the West again.
Yeah, same here. They're my number 1 team going. I would actually still go with the Golden State Warriors, even though, like, as you said, like, injuries are going to be a big factor going forward, especially since now they're going to be cracking down on resting players during the regular season. And so we'll see how much that leads to wear and tear, especially since this is a Golden State team that has played in the last 3 finals, and you have to think that playing that much basketball is going to wear it down on the body. And you have Klay's off-season shenanigans and all that, so maybe that might factor in. I don't know, but that also being said, this is still a solid team top to bottom. Bringing back Iguodala was very paramount, even though he's very much on the tail end of his career. He's someone that just can do everything for you. He's your Swiss Army man, and he's even at this late age, and he's someone that can help sort of just anchor that second unit. Well, now let's move on to arguably the second best team in the West. Alongside the Houston Rockets, I would put this team, Oklahoma City, to be up there, and they made some massive improvements this offseason in an attempt to show a very successful attempt, I would say, to show Russell Westbrook that they are in it to win it and get him to sign for the long term. Kevin, what do you have to say about the Oklahoma City Thunder?
Yeah, I definitely agree. They're the biggest threat to the Warriors with those additions of Paul George and Carmelo Anthony. The scoring will definitely be there, and Russ is going to average insane numbers again this season. Granted, he's not going to average triple-double again, but his rebounds will probably go down. His assist numbers are going to go up because with all the scoring options around him. But big problem with OKC is really their bench. And if you look at their bench, they have Patrick Patterson as their 6th man. And look at the rest of the guys, it's guys like Samaj Kristen, Alex Abrines, Cal Sigler, and a bunch of other guys who probably belong in the G League. Their depth will really be a problem this year. And I can see the Thunder being one major injury away from not even making the playoffs. But assuming everything works out and Russ, Carmelo, and PG can play off each other, even though they're 3 ball-dominant guys, I can see them challenging the Warriors during the regular season, but in a 7-game series, I don't think OKC will have enough. And keep in mind, the Thunder also are under a lot of pressure to win the title or at least make the finals this year with this team. If they don't, Paul George and Carmelo are probably gone. PG has already said openly to the media that he wants to play in LA. And if Paul George leaves, I really don't see a reason for Melo to stay and play out the rest of his career in OKC.
Yeah, so I think on paper, this team looks stacked with Russell Westbrook, the reigning MVP, Carmelo Anthony, Paul George. And you mentioned the bench. Patrick Patterson has been a decent 6-man swing 3-point shooter. They also added Raymond Felton, who's a veteran. And I liked what I saw from Alex Abrines. But I have real questions on how it's all going to come together. And we mentioned it when Carmelo was added and when Paul George was added. But this offense last year was all Russ. And Billy Donovan, he's got his work cut out from how he's going to run this offensive team, because they basically have to change what they did last year completely with Paul George, a guy that needs the ball. Carmelo throughout his career has needed the ball. So maybe Billy Donovan puts it all together and shuts people like me up, and they're second in the West and they take the Warriors to 7 games. But I think to completely change the way you play and bringing in those big personalities, I think it's going to be a bit of a struggle to start off the year. So I have them around 4th in the West. I think their ceiling is really high, but as Kevin mentioned, they pick up some injuries. I could see this team falling out and maybe not missing the playoffs, but being like 6th or 7th, which is where they were last year.
Yeah, I agree with everything you guys said. Although that being said, I will say don't discount this team. I mean, yes, they're 1 to 2 injuries away from basically having to trade away Paul George and Carmelo Anthony just to make sure that they can still build a team around Russ. That also being said, like I think I mentioned this before, but they're in a way they're trying to mimic that core of Russ, Serge Ibaka, and Kevin Durant that they had that was able to take that Golden State team to 7 games 2 years ago, and just having Paul George in that Kevin Durant position, and then having Carmelo sort of being in that Serge Ibaka position, although definitely in a very, very different role from what Serge Ibaka brings. Another thing that this team is probably counting on is the way that the GM has been able to sort of reload at mid-season and always pick up some decent bench players at the trade deadline. They've somehow always been able to pull a rabbit out of their hat one way or another. And I think that's what they're banking on. Another thing that should be interesting is who I believe is going to be their X factor going forward this year, Steven Adams. I mean, he's developed into a fairly solid option at center, but at the same time too, he's going to be someone that has to really step up. And I don't know if he can, especially in the ways that the NBA has been changing at center. And so, I mean, like, if he's able to dominate the post, I mean, that's one of the weaknesses of the Golden State Warriors is that they have Zaza Pachulia and JaVale, I believe, but that none of those two can really stack up to what Steven Adams could possibly bring you. But that also being said, like, you know, Steven Adams is more of your post player. And so it's going to be really, really dependent on Russ, Paul George, and Carmelo to try to match that Golden State team and being able to shoot from the perimeter in order to make up for the fact that, I mean, you have Steven Adams, who just is really going to be just someone that's going to, like, just try to catch rebounds, defend the paint, and try to post up.
Let's move on to the final Texas team. And I think that this team is under the radar again, but they were so good last year. They won 60 games. They're the number 2 seed. But Kevin, what are your thoughts on the San Antonio Spurs?
Yeah, like you said, Spurs are probably going to win 60-plus games this year again, as is Spurs tradition. They had a pretty quiet offseason. They re-signed Pau Gasol, and they added Rudy Gay for 2 years, $17 million. They pretty much had the same roster as they did last season. And I feel like a lot of people, as you said, are still sleeping on the Spurs again. But I really think they're the only team that has proven that they can consistently hang with the Warriors. They blew them out twice last year during the regular season. And they were up by like 25 or something in game 1 of the conference finals before Zaza took out Kawhi's ankles. If Kawhi hadn't been injured, I really think they could have taken the Warriors to 7 games and even possibly win that series. And Kawhi, who's shown that he's not only an elite defender, but a legit scoring threat as well. I think he wins the MVP this year. He's entering a season where it's clear that he's the go-to guy, whereas last year, people wondering whether it was LaMarcus Aldridge's team or Kawhi's team. But it's pretty clear now because Aldridge was pretty awful last season. I can see with Kawhi leading this team, I can see them being maybe the number 2 seed in the West.
Yeah, I think the Spurs will still be good. Kawhi, as you mentioned, yeah, I think that's a really good pick for MVP. I hadn't thought about it, but him coming off that breakout year last year, and I think Russ' stats will be a little bit down. I think Harden's stats might be a little bit down with both those teams adding alpha dogs to the squad. So I think Kawhi, pretty good pick. As you mentioned, LaMarcus Aldridge has looked pretty good this preseason, but he fell off the table last year in the playoffs. So I think whether or not he can stay healthy and keep his game at a high level, I think is key for the Spurs. I think losing Jonathan Simmons might be a big loss because he was that guy off the bench. He's so young, but he could defend. He could get to the rim whenever he wanted. They replaced him with Rudy Gay, who throughout his career has just been a chucker. He can score 25 points a game, but he's going to need 25 shots to get there. So we're going to see how Greg Popovich implements him into that Spurs rotation, because we know the Spurs way is to pass the ball first and keep it moving. And Rudy Gay throughout his career hasn't fit into that mold. Point guard spot's going to be interesting. Tony Parker suffered that gruesome injury. He's 35 at this point. So how much he contributes, I think DeJounte Murray showed flashes and stretches last year. So I think he could take more of a point guard starting role for them. And then they still have the shooters in Danny Green and Patty Mills. And Manu's around for another run, although he'll probably have limited minutes throughout the year. So I think this team I'll pick them 3rd in the West. I think Greg Popovich always seems to make it work. And I think Kawhi is a potential MVP this year.
I'm going to agree with you guys on that, Kawhi being the potential MVP winner for this upcoming season. Honestly, he's my pick for MVP. I mean, you just saw like how this team just was completely just unable to get anything going once he went down in the Western Conference Championship last year. How like dominant that team was with Kawhi being able to play on the court. And granted, yeah, he's their best player and far and away they're like only all-star, but I mean like he was so good that he was able to put like the Golden State Warriors pretty much on the ropes in game one in Golden State. That also being said, I think I only have them at fourth, and I know it's a bad idea to discount Kawhi and Greg Popovich, but as a lot of you guys have pointed out, things to be worried about is definitely the age of the supporting roster around Kawhi. But I would say specifically looking at LaMarcus, you hear all the stories about how he doesn't seem to have the same fire within him that people like Tim Duncan had or something like that. And granted, like it's hard to have as much like have that compete level as someone that's one of the all-time greats, but you're definitely concerned with that, especially with also the injuries too. And that's something that he has to get through as well. Like he was able to sort of at least be there during the playoffs, but it's hard to tell where his head is at right now, if he's able to like recommit or if he's just someone that's still kind of going to be lost. And so we'll see what happens with him, and as well as also I think don't discount losing Jonathan Simmons. And as much as and as Juan has pointed out, like replacing him with Rudy Gay, who's more of a chucker than anything else, may not be the best move. And on top of that, Jonathan Simmons was a pretty decent defender and was someone that like arguably you could say like during the season as well as the playoffs was the Spurs' second best player, which is really surprising to say. But we shall see what magic Popovich is able to pull over this team and how he's able to make all the pieces fit.
All right, and let's talk about one more Western Conference team, and we'll move on to the East. The Minnesota Timberwolves made splashy moves in the offseason. What do you think about their upcoming campaign, Kevin?
Yeah, I think the Wolves make it to the playoffs for sure this year. They added Jimmy Butler and Jeff Teague in the offseason to a young lineup with Karl-Anthony Towns at center and Andrew Wiggins, who recently signed a max extension. And they're starting to look really good on paper. But the Wolves have been notorious for underperforming in the face of high expectations. So they really have to make sure they deliver this year for their fans. They haven't made the postseason in 13 years, which is the longest drought for any franchise in the NBA. They added Jimmy Butler, who's an all-star and an all-NBA talent. And they have Karl-Anthony Towns going to his third year, who many GMs are saying is currently the best center in the league. So if the Wolves miss the playoffs again this year with this squad, they should just move the team to Seattle, honestly. They really have no excuse not to make the playoffs. But I think Tom Thibodeau is going to work it out with the Kings out with the roster, and they should be I expect them to be a 5 or 6 seed come April.
Wow, move to Seattle. Oh, man. Yeah, I think they're going to be much better. I think I'm going to pick them 5th in the West. I had a lot of questions with Tom Thibodeau putting that together, but he's had a track record of putting together like great defensive teams in Chicago. And I think that's something Minnesota really struggled with a couple of years. I think Karl-Anthony Towns, this guy is a throwback. He's new age. He's everything you want in a center. He can pop out and shoot threes. He can bang down in the post. He's just a special player. Andrew Wiggins, I think how he fits with Jimmy Butler is going to be key. Andrew Wiggins and Butler, I think, are similar players. They don't have much three-point range, but they can shoot really good mid-range and drive to the rim with the best of them. And then Jeff Teague is a slashing guard as well. And so we talked about this a little bit during the offseason, but how they space the floor and how they run that offense. Off the bench, they have Jamal Crawford, who's a veteran, can provide instant offense off the bench. And so I think there's a lot of veterans here. They also added Taj Gibson. Those veterans, I think, with a veteran head coach and Tom Thibodeau, will allow and support those young stars in Wiggins and Towns and bring them into the playoffs for the first time in 13 years. So this team has a lot of upside. I don't really see a scenario where they don't make the playoffs this year.
Yeah, I agree. I don't see this Minnesota Timberwolves missing out on the playoffs again, and I definitely see them breaking that long drought. I see them probably finishing 5th. That being said, I do have some reservations with this team. I mean, right now, the three-point shooting is a bit of a question mark going forward because right now your best three-point shooter is your center. And as much as I enjoy Karl-Anthony Towns in just like every facet of the game, him being your best three-point shooter is going to not exactly be able to help with the spacing. But that being said, I do expect Andrew Wiggins to make the leap this year to finally being like a true tried and true all-star. I also look for Wiggins to finally be able to step up as a perimeter defender, and being able to play alongside a veteran like Jimmy Butler should really help him make that leap. Jeff Teague, I think, is a bit underrated as a three-point shooter. I mean, he's, I think, 2 to 3 years removed from being above .400 from the 3-point line. I mean, the biggest question mark really to me for this team is going to be Taj Gibson and how he fits. He's not someone that really stretches the floor offensively, and he's really more of a post player, but you're now putting him at the 4. It's going to be interesting to see how he and Karl Anthony Towns mesh both offensively and defensively, especially if they try doing switches to better amplify each other's strengths or cover up each other's weaknesses, essentially. Like, Tom Thibodeau has a lot on his plate going forward, and especially since this bench isn't as deep as you'd like it to be. But that being said, the starting 5 right there is what's going to either make or break your season. And while I don't think they have the same potential of, like, if they have like one injury, them like not making the playoffs.
All right, let's move on to the East. The Cleveland Cavaliers are the 2-time Eastern Conference champions, but they made a bunch of moves this offseason. Kevin.
Yeah, as you mentioned, they made some pretty notable moves. They added Derrick Rose and Dwayne Wade to minimum deals, and they also got Isaiah Thomas and Jay Crowder in that Irving trade to the Celtics. And really, I mean, the top 4 seeds in the East, it's going to be Cleveland, Boston, Washington, and Toronto. And the seeding will really depend on how hard LeBron wants to play during the season. He can pretty much be on cruise control during the regular season. The Cavs drop to the 3rd or 4th seed, and they still destroy everyone in the playoffs. Or if he really wants to, he can easily go for the number 1 seed and win MVP. The Cavs roster is super stacked this year, so really it can go either way depending on what LeBron wants to do. The Cavs significantly improved their depth from last year. So I wouldn't be surprised if LeBron just cruises during the regular season and lets his teammates take over. So really they can be either the 1 seed or the 4 seed. It really doesn't matter.
Yeah, I agree. The regular season doesn't matter for this team. It's all about the playoffs and whether or not they can beat Golden State in a 7-game series. Very interesting. I didn't agree with them getting rid of Kyrie, but the haul that they got from the Boston Celtics was sensational. And I think Isaiah Thomas has some injury issues, but I think as a 1 year left on his deal, I think he has a lot to prove. And I think leading the league in scoring in the 4th quarter is going to be a real asset for them. The Dwayne Wade addition, I'm not that big on. Okay, he and LeBron are friends, and they won a couple titles in Miami, but I'm not really big on what he adds to this team, both defensively and offensively at this point. The Jay Crowder he brings defense and toughness on the wing that they were kind of missing. So, yeah, again, this team, it really doesn't matter where they finish in the regular season. I'm going to pick them to win the Eastern Conference. I guess I'll just pick them first just because I think they're the best team.
Same. I mean, you guys brought up very good points about whether or not, they're going to try as hard in the regular season. I mean, like, this team is not in any danger of missing the playoffs, I'd say, even if LeBron does go on cruise control. Now, that being said, you definitely have some questions about Isaiah Thomas. I mean, yeah, obviously you have to wonder whether or not he's able to return to form after that injury and being out for so long. But I would say also the bigger thing is also just, this team really struggled defensively, and Isaiah Thomas, as much as he tries, is not that great defensively. But that being said, being able to add Jay Crowder, and I think you guys are underrating Dwayne Wade. He's not as good as he once was on either end, but he's still an asset defensively and someone that can help with second unit going forward. It's going to be interesting to see how this team is able to sort of get those rotations going, and just to see like whether or not they're able to space the minutes out accordingly and to the best of their abilities. And I think something that you guys overlooked, Kevin Love is probably going to be out to prove something as well, just to show that he's no longer just your 3rd best player, but he can help carry this team when LeBron is on cruise control as well. He's looking to prove something himself. Now, that being said, I still think that losing Kyrie in the long term really hurts this team. Also, I think at the end of the day, part of the reason why I enjoyed them adding Dwayne Wade was just like how Dwayne Wade was able to sort of screw over this Cleveland team, and then now he's joining the Cleveland team that he once lured his best friend away from. So pick this team to be number 1, even though I doubt that they will. And a lot of it has to do with just the fact that they're more than likely still going to win the Eastern Conference.
Yeah, the future for this team, I wouldn't bet on it at this point. It's a really aging roster, and depending on what they do with Isaiah, I wouldn't buy this team in 5 years. But let's move on. Let's talk about the Boston Celtics. They were the partner for the Cavs in that big trade, but what do you think about their upcoming season, Kevin?
Yeah, the Boston Celtics really revamped their entire roster, starting with the Kyrie Irving trade. It'll be interesting to see how Kyrie adjusts to being the number 1 option on his own team. because the style of the play on the Celtics is completely different than the Cavs. Kyrie will be playing more in the system set up by Brad Stevens, whereas in Cleveland, LeBron pretty much ran the entire offense. And also the chemistry is a big question mark with the whole roster being filled with new players like Gordon Hayward, who is an all-star, and also they drafted a future star in Jason Tatum, playing alongside Al Horford and Marcus Smart. Really, with all these pieces, if Brad Stevens can figure out how to make them mesh all together, they have a really good chance of challenging the Cavs in the Eastern Conference Finals, and I think they're going to make it there. I have them as the number 2 seed in the East, and I think they're going to do well.
Yeah, I think in the short term, this team kind of went sideways with all the additions. I think they're about where they were last year. They did lose a lot. We mentioned Isaiah Thomas, Drake Crowder, but they also lost Avery Bradley, who is their shooting guard, great defensive player, and second scorer on that team. So I think they're going to need guys like Marcus Smart and Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, who is their top first-round pick, to step up and fill those wing roles. But I think Brad Stevens is a great coach, and I think this team is the second best in the East. I think out front is going to be interesting. There's not a lot of depth there. Al Horford has not lived up to that huge contract. At this point, I think he's declining as a player. Marcus Morris is a good three-point shooter, but I don't know how much toughness he brings inside. So I think that might be their biggest weakness inside in the paint, but their guard should be good, and I think Gordon Hayward will fit well with his former college coach.
For sure, yeah. I actually think you're underrating the bench a little bit. I mean, that being said, like I'm banking more on the potential of this bench than necessarily what they've been able to produce so far. But I definitely don't think you should be sleeping on Morris there, as well as, I mean, I believe Jason Tatum will technically be coming off the bench just because of, I mean, who's in front of him. But I mean, Jason Tatum could very well become a sixth man candidate if he's able to live up to the third overall billing, which would be like, I mean, I know most rookies don't usually win that or like come into contention, but like he has the potential to, I'd say. I mean, I'd say the biggest question mark for this team is, I mean, you brought up Al Horford not really living up to his contract, but I think like with the talent around him, it takes the pressure off him to be able to do that. But I would say really like figuring out how to replace Avery Bradley is going to be a big question, because he was your 3-and-D guy and he was a premier 3-and-D guy. Now you're replacing him with Marcus Smart, who, I mean, he's a very speedy guy and he's good at slashing the ball, but he doesn't really shoot from three, and his perimeter defense isn't as great as Avery Bradley was. So it's going to be interesting to see how he's able to replace that. But yeah, just going forward, this is, I would say, the second best team in the East.
All right, let's move on. Let's talk about the Washington Wizards, Kevin.
Yeah, the Wizards are also a pretty good contender in the East. They signed John Wall to a multi-year extension. But other than that, they had a relatively quiet offseason. They picked up Jody Meeks for 2 years, $7 million, and Mike Scott for a vet minimum. They still arguably have the best backcourt in the East in John Wall and Bradley Beal. And with how depleted the East will be of stars this year, I think Bradley Beal has a pretty good chance of breaking out and making his first All-Star appearance. The Wizards were able to challenge the Cavs last season, and were actually my dark horse team to potentially make the finals. But with all the additions the Cavs and the Celtics have made during the offseason, those two teams are even better than they were last year and are pretty much head and shoulders above everyone else in the East. So I think the Wizards will have a good regular season, probably winning 50 games for the first time, good enough for the third seed. But I don't expect them to get past either the Cavs or the Celtics in the playoffs.
Yeah, they are playing for third. I mean, they did give Boston a 7-game series last year in the Eastern Conference semifinals, but I think the Celtics have improved, and this team is still good. As you mentioned, that backcourt is really good with Wall and Beal. I think potential breakout player Otto Porter stepped up last year, but I think he has more in his game, and I think he could be a potential all-star this year. Kelly Oubre Jr. as well was pretty good for them. He's got another year of experience under his belt, and so I think he can develop into that six-man guy off the bench that can provide energy and scoring. Like Boston, I have questions up front. Marcin Gortat at this point, I don't think is a quality starting NBA center. And then Jan Mahimi is okay. Jason Smith also. So that front line, I think, will hold this team back. But they have a lot of guys on the wing, and I think this team is third in the East.
I agree with everything you guys said about this Washington Wizards team. Like at this point, they're really competing for third, which is unfortunate because they were able to build that core of John Wall, Bradley Beal, and Otto Porter, who I agree with Quan there, has a lot more to prove and has the potential to be even better, But unfortunately, they're playing at this season. They're playing at a time where Boston has been able to reload like no other, and Cleveland has been able to just retool their team in a way that doesn't really cause them to get any worse. So really stinks for them, but at the same time, this is still a young enough core that they can compete later on. And for them, what's going to be real necessary is just developing that bench. And I know we talked about how their front court's not really all that good, but at this point, really, they're just trying to focus on those three that I mentioned. That's part of their core, and just hope for at least solid seasons from their 4 and their 5. They're going to have a great regular season. I definitely believe Bradley Beal will be an all-star this year. Maybe they do pull off the upset. I don't know. I don't foresee that happening. But let's move on to another favorite, the Toronto Raptors. Kevin Hahn, what's your take on the team from up north?
Yeah, the Raptors have always been a good team. They pretty much kept the same roster they had last year. They signed Kyle Lowry to a 3-year, $100 million contract and Serge Ibaka to a 3-year, $65 million contract. These signings give the Raptors a 3-year window to remain competitive in the East. And General Manager Masai Ujiri believes he has a shot of winning the Eastern Conference in that time period. I think he's anticipating that the top 2 spots in the East open up a little with talks of LeBron leaving Cleveland next year. And even in Boston, if the Kyrie Irving situation doesn't work out, there's a chance that he leaves as well. But for this year, at least, they'll be pretty competitive in the East. I have them 4th in the East. They'll have a decent regular season record, probably win around 45 games. But I think it'll be reminiscent of the last season in the playoffs. They'll ultimately lose in the second round, either to the Cavs or the Celtics.
Yeah, this is a team I think is trending in the wrong direction. You're always going to have a chance with Lowry and DeRozan in the backcourt. I think they are probably the two that will challenge the Wizards' backcourt for best in the East. And they get Serge Ibaka for a full year. I think he definitely improved their defense throughout the year. This team was still top 10 in both offense and defense. So they're still a really good team. But I just have questions about their depth. CJ Miles is a decent NBA player, but is he starting caliber? And then Norman Powell was good for them in the playoffs, but I need to see more of that during the regular season. So I think this team is, I'll say they're 5th in the East. I think they're around mid-tier teams that has an opportunity to pull an upset, but I wouldn't put any money on it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you with the Toronto Raptors. This is also another team that has arguably one of the best backcourts in the league, up there with the Washington Wizards. DeMar DeRozan, Kyle Lowry, they were able to bring back, as well as Serge Ibaka. They were able to keep that core together. Obviously, unfortunately, for them, the league changed, and because of that, Jonas Valanciunas, who is looking like a future all-star at the center position, although I wouldn't say all the way top choice, but it's more of a injury fill-in. But the game has really passed him by, and he's been trying to really change things up. But this team is, just like with the Washington Wizards, was really hoping for the top 2 teams to fall off, and unfortunately for them, they only got better. So just like with the Wizards, they'll be competing for the 3rd overall spot. And we'll see how the regular season plays out. But I predict them to finish 4th.
All right, and let's talk about our final team in this preview. We'll talk about the Milwaukee Bucks. Kevin.
Yeah, the Milwaukee Bucks will have them finishing around 5th in the East. They still have their future star in Giannis Antetokounmpo, and he's also a dark horse for MVP this year. But I think it'll be a couple of years before he really matures into that all-star role. And they still have really solid guys in Jabari Parker, Chris Middleton. Their defense has always been pretty good in the East. So, yeah, I have them finishing 5th in the East. I don't expect them to make a lot of noise in the playoffs, but a really good, solid core going forward.
Yeah, I have them 4th in the East. I think they have a good mix of young players ready to break out and veteran depth. And I think that's key for any team making a jump. As you mentioned, Giannis Antetokounmpo last year, most improved player. I think he's ready to be in that MVP conversation this coming year. I think a big key for them is getting Jabari Parker back healthy. He's expected to be out until February. So I think he's a big piece, both scoring, rebounding. Chris Middleton, I like. Malcolm Brogdon coming off a Rookie of the Year campaign. I like him as a starting caliber point guard over Matt Dellavedova, who's been starting for them. And then up front, John Henson, Greg Monroe, and then Thon Maker, who came on in the playoffs. I really like the upside on him no matter what age he is. So I like Milwaukee. I have them fourth in the East.
Yeah, I like Milwaukee too. This is a good young core, and fortunately for them, it's a young enough core that they don't necessarily have to worry about them overlapping with cores of Cleveland, but they do have to still compete with core of the Boston Celtics. And again, like you brought up, I mean, the big question for them going forward is whether or not Jabari Parker can come back healthy and be able to be playing at an all-star level, which they were hoping to do when they first drafted him second overall back in 2014. And fortunately for them, though, it's the big story for them, and the thing that's really been holding them back has been injuries. Pretty much everyone beyond Giannis has been battling injuries and has missed significant amount of time going forward. I mean, you had Chris Middleton missing the first half of the season, and then Jabari missing the second half, and looks like he's going to be missing the first half of this upcoming season. And this is like kind of the second time he's missed significant time due to injury. And so it's going to be interesting to see whether or not they're able to stay healthy enough for the playoffs. Now, Malcolm Brogdon did come off a Rookie of the Year campaign. Unfortunately, I would say like this past Rookies of the Year were not the top of the top class, although Joel Embiid is looking like a future star of this league. And just unfortunately, he had to miss a majority of the season due to injury, and also had to split votes from his teammate Dario Saric. But that being said, this is a very intriguing team going forward. You obviously want to look at how each one develops, but the most interesting development has to be Thon Maker, who everyone wrote off when he was first selected and how everyone was making fun of the Milwaukee Bucks for doing this. But I mean, you look at him now and how he was able to turn it on against the Toronto Raptors, and I mean, he's looking like another smart pick. And not only that, he's someone that can shoot it from three as well. And so he's someone that can very well develop into sort of your modern NBA center. This team I have as fifth overall in the East, but a team that could very easily jump to third if everything goes the right way for them.
Okay. Kevin, are there a couple other teams that we didn't talk about that you think might be sleepers potentially this year?
Yeah, so my sleepers in the East to make the playoffs are the Sixers. They finally all have their young guys healthy, knock on wood, Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons. And we'll be able to see them play alongside their number one pick, Markelle Fultz. And it's going to be a really exciting team to watch. And I expect them to make the 7th or 8th seed. And another team I'm actually really excited for are the Brooklyn Nets. I actually think they're going to make some noise in the East. For the longest time, they've been the laughing stock of the league and have been crucified for moves like giving up all their picks for old guys like Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce. But now they basically have a brand new team. They traded Brook Lopez during the offseason for D'Angelo Russell, who I think will thrive in the Nets offense, and he'll have a lot to prove. He wants to show that the Lakers made a mistake in trading him. They also added guys like Timothy Mozgov, Alan Crabb, Damari Carroll, really solid rotation guys. And they also drafted Jarrett Allen from UT, who was a dominant force in college. And they're doing really well in preseason. And I really think they're going to surprise some teams this year. And I wouldn't be surprised if they make the playoffs.
Okay, and for prediction's sake, I guess, who do you guys have in the NBA Finals, and who do you guys have winning it all this year?
My answer is going to be boring. It's going to be Golden State and the Cavs in the finals. I think Golden State wins the finals in 6 games.
Golden State over Cleveland.
Oh, man, you guys are so lame. You know what? I'm going to go out on a limb just because I don't want to see Golden State Cleveland version 4. Houston over Boston. Why not?
Go for it. Yeah, that sounds fun.
Yeah, that's wishful thinking right there.
Yeah, just a little bit. But anyways, Kevin, I want to thank you so much for coming on again and presenting your insight. Thank you so much.
Yeah, guys, thanks for having me, and go Astros.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much.
I want you guys to visit our website, TwoNatesOnSports.com. Also like us on Facebook at TwoNatesOnSports. Subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music, where you'll get a notification as soon as we release our new episodes. Also, you can send us any suggestions and comments to our email at TwoNatesOnSports@gmail.com. We'll be back this weekend for a regular episode, and we'll talk to you guys then.